Shalom, 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 family. It's your sister Shia back again with the He-Man Woman Haters Club. We are still reading The Creation of the Patriarchy by Gerda Lerner. We are on chapter 3 called The Stand-In Wife and the Pawn. Let me turn my music down a little bit. Okay, so the process by which scattered Neolithic villages became agricultural communities, then urban centers, and finally states has been called the urban revolution or the rise of civilization. It is a process which occurs at different times in different places throughout the world. First, in the Great River and coastal valleys of China, Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and Mesoamerica, later in Africa, Northern Europe, and Malaysia. Archaic states are everywhere characterized by the emergence of property classes and hierarchies. Commodity production with a high degree of specialization and organized trade over distant regions, urbanism, the emergence and consolidation of military elites, kingship, the institutionalization of slavery, a transition from kin dominance to patriarchal families as the chief mode of distributing goods and power. In Mesopotamia, there also occur important changes in the position of women. Female subordination within the family becomes institutionalized and codified in law. Prostitution becomes established and regulated. With increasing specialization of work, women are gradually excluded from certain occupations and professions. After the invention of writing and the establishment of formal learning, women are excluded from equal access to such education. The cosmogonies, which provide the religious underpinning for the archaic state, subordinate female deities to chief male gods, and feature myths of origin which legitimate male ascendancy. Most theories of the origin of the archaic state have been single cause prime mover theories, stressing in turn the following as causes: capital accumulation due to new technologies, which results in class stratification and class struggle. Marx, Engels, Child. The rise of strong bureaucracies due to the need for the development of large-scale irrigation projects, population increase and population pressure. Population increase and population pressure, then population pressure in a circumscribed environment leading to militarism, which in turn leads to state formation. Each of these explanations has been criticized and replaced by more complex, system-oriented explanations, which stress the interactions of a variety of factors. Robert M.C. McC Adams, while recognizing the importance of environmental and technological factors in the growth of civilizations, stressed that the core of the urban revolution lay in changes in social organization. Intensification of agricultural production due to specialization led to a stable food base, which allowed the population to increase. Food redistribution was managed by the temple community, which gave this group the power to coerce farmers and herders to produce surplus. This could be best this could best be done by increasing irrigation, which in turn increased the power of the temple elite and led to sharper distinctions of wealth between those who owned land closer to a steady water supply and those who did not. This early class formation led to the next important shift in societal structure, that from kin based to class based. It is this change from kin based to class based social structures which has particular significance for the history of women. Several feminist writers have recently called attention to this aspect of the urban revolution, which will be further explored in this chapter. The anthropologist Raina Rapp points to the conflict between kinship groups and rising elites and concludes that kinship structures were the great losers in the civilization process. In pre state societies, total social production was organized through kinship. As states gradually arose, kinship structures got stripped and transformed to underwrite the existence and legitimacy of more powerful politicized domains. In this process, women were subordinated with and in relation to kinship. We will need to examine in the case of Mesopotamian societies just how this process of transformation took place and why it took the form it did. We must not imagine this as a linear process which uniformly developed in different regions, but rather as a slow accretion of incremental changes, which occurred at different speeds in different regions and with varying outcomes. In the words of Charles Redman, it should be conceptualized as a series of interacting incremental processes that were triggered by favorable ecological and cultural conditions and that continued to develop through mutually reinforcing interactions. There were overall three stages in the urban revolution in Mesopotamia: the emergence of temple towns, the growth of city states, and the development of national states. We have earlier discussed Neolithic towns of considerable size, such as Catalhuyuk and Hassalar in Anatolia. In the 6th and 8th millennium BC, even these early settlements' burial customs revealed differences in wealth and status among the town dwellers, as well as the existence of craft specialization and distant trade. One can assume that similar village and town communities existed in the Mesopotamian region. While Catalhuyuk and Hassalar disappeared as settlements before 5000 BC, village farming communities in Mesopotamia gradually spread into the southern lowlands. Growing populations in a constricted space on land, which was fertile only if water was available, inevitably led to the development of irrigation. This would lead to distinctions in wealth depending on the location of a farmer's land and to tension between communal and private property rights and interests. In an ecologically constricted space, growing populations can be supplied only by increasing agricultural production or by expansion. The former leads to the development of elites, the latter to the development of militarism, first on a voluntary, then on a professional basis. In Mesopotamia, these social formations took the form of temple towns, which developed in the 4th and 3rd millennia BC. Under conditions of intertribal warfare, the existence of towns acts as a magnet for the populations of surrounding villages, who migrate to the city to find work or to seek protection in times of war or famine. Such populations then became the laborers in the large enterprises, which made possible the construction of huge temple complexes and of centralized irrigation projects. The temple engaged in complex religious, political, and economic activities. Archaeological evidence shows that from 3000 BC on, temple hierarchies coordinated the construction and maintenance of a system of canals that were many miles long and demanded the cooperation of a number of communities. The financing of such vast enterprises, the maintenance of labor squads paid in rations, and the investment of surpluses in the mass production of certain craft products for export all led to the consolidation of power and the specialization of function in the hands of a temple bureaucracy. The temple fostered the development of crafts, which implies the strengthening of craft specialization, including metallurgy and the large scale production of textiles for export. The temple controlled raw materials and monopolized trade. In turn, the management and administration of such large projects fostered the rise of skilled administrative elites and eventually led to the development of standardized information systems. The first symbol systems, or tokens, developed in connection with trading activities and the keeping of accounts. One of these tokens developed systems of counting and writing. The earliest clay tablets in Sumer were ration lists, records of tribute and donations, and lists of divine names. The invention of fully developed writing, which incorporated grammatical elements, occurred shortly after 3000 BC in Sumer. It marked a watershed in the development of Mesopotamian civilization. It is generally believed that it originated in the temples and palaces and was a knowledge that greatly strengthened the leadership role of the elites. Schools systematically trained scribes to meet all the needs of governance, including sacred knowledge. Later, the establishment of archives further institutionalized the administration of economic and political activities in temple and palace. It is, of course, with the invention of writing and the keeping of written records that history begins. The proto-historic period, 3500 to 2800 BC, coincides with the archaeological Uruk fifth early dynastic period. It can be assumed that during this period, military elites developed next to temple elites and soon became an independent and rival force in society. Military strongmen would first become chieftains over villages and later establish their dominance over previously communally held temple lands and herds, gradually pushing the priest into the background. We will examine the process in detail below in the case of Urukagina of Lagash. Later, the strongest of these chieftains would set themselves up as kings, usurping power over the temples and treating temple property as their own. In the ensuing centuries of intercity warfare, the strongest of these rulers would unite a number of such city-states into a kingdom or a national state. The development of militarism combined with the need for a large labor force for the construction of public projects led to the practice of turning captives into slaves and to the eventual institutionalization of slavery, and with it of structured classes. We will discuss this development and its impact on women in detail in the next chapter. What concerns us here is that all these various interacting and mutually reinforcing processes went in the direction of strengthening male dominance in public life and in external relations, while weakening the power of communal and kin-based structures. In the proto-historic period, kinship groups continued to be important, some holding land titles, others recruiting guilds of craftsmen or organizing recruits for military service. In his comparison of the urban revolution in Mesopotamia, 3900 to 2300 BC, and in central Mexico, 100 BC through 1500 AD, Robert McC. Adams finds a similar function performed by Mexican kinship units, the caliples, which are used to distribute wealth and power in the new state. They form guilds, provide men for army service, and are allocated slaves by the state. As the state becomes consolidated, changes in kinship structure become solidified. In the Inca Empire, the conquerors extended their rule by forcing conquered villages to provide virgins for state service and as potential wives for Inca noblemen. This interference in the sexual and marriage patterns of the conquered served the dual function of undermining kinship structures and of singling out particular kin groups for alliances with the conquerors. We will see a similar process at work in Mesopotamia in the practice of destroying conquered towns, killing the men and deporting the women and children to slavery in the land of the conquerors, and in the network of marriage alliances among rulers to cement interstate cooperation. That should remind you of the Pocahontas situation I read about yesterday. Modern archaeological work in Mesopotamia has uncovered tens of thousands of clay tablets that document the social order in Sumer. In the third millennium and in Babylon in the second millennium BC, which we will use to highlight changes in the position of women, such sources can be compared and brought into reference with seals, statues, and other artifacts, as well as with the usual archaeological evidence from graves and town sites. Since many of the clay tablets contain poems, hymns, and laws, in addition to more mundane remnants of commercial and domestic transactions, we can reconstruct this Bronze Age civilization with more evidence than is true for other early civilizations. As will be the case for much of the historical period to follow that age, evidence for upper class women is easier to come by than for lower class women. Since we are not attempting to write a social history of women in the ancient Near East, but rather to trace the evolution of concepts of gender, our account will select significant models and moments rather than attempt a full historic reconstruction. One of the earliest known portraits of a woman in Sumer is a carefully sculpted head from Uruk, portraying a woman of great dignity and beauty who might have been a priestess, a queen, or a goddess. This unique sculpture dating from between 3100 and 2900 BC personifies the major roles played by aristocratic women who were active in temple, palace, and economic management. It is characteristic of leadership in this early period that there is a merging of divine and secular power personified by the ruler. The King List, a document written down in about 1800 BC, traces the successive dynasties for the major cities in Mesopotamia back into the third millennium. While the chronologies are somewhat inflated, archaeologists have verified some of the data with other evidence. The early Sumerian dynasties were based in the cities of Kish, Warka, and Ur. According to the King List, the founder of the dynasty of Kish was Queen Kubaba, who is listed as having reigned 100 years. She is identified as having formerly been a tavern keeper, an occupation which puts her at the margins of society. She was later identified with the goddess Kubaba, who was worshipped in northern Mesopotamia. She is the only woman listed in the King List as reigning in her own right, but the merging of her historic personality with that of a divinity is not unlike that of the mythical demigod Gilgamesh, ruler of Warka, who supposedly reigned in the early dynastic period, but for whose historical existence there is no hard evidence, and whose exploits are immortalized in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The excavations at made in 1922 through 34 by Sir Leonard Woolley in behalf of the British Museum, offer us a startling insight into the social structure of Sumerian society in the early dynastic period, around 2500 BC. The discovery of 1,850 graves, among them 16 royal graves, yielded important information about burial customs in a society characterized by class stratification, wealth, and artistic development, as well as by a fairly advanced technology. In one of the graves, a lazuli seal inscribed to Nimbanda, the queen, wife of Masanapada, identifies a woman who may have been the wife of a king of the first dynasty of Ur. The evidence of her husband's existence is important in that it confirmed the historical accuracy of the Sumerian king list. Of particular interest to us are the findings in Royal Grave 789, that of a king whose identity has not been clearly established, and in Grave 800, that of Queen Puabi, who probably lived around 2500 BC. Her identity was established by a cylinder seal of lapis lazuli inscribed with her name, which was found near her body. In each case, the royal body was found in a stone chamber together with several others, presumably servants. This evidence of human sacrifice illuminates a set of religious beliefs and values associated only with this early period. It is significant that the hundreds of other graves in the cemeteries of show no sign of human sacrifice, only the royal graves do. It is also noteworthy that two queens are buried with their servants, just as the kings are, which would indicate that what was being honored by human sacrifice was kingship, and that at this early period, this divine quality could reside in a woman as well as in a man. In graves 789 and 800, the burial chamber was located at the end of a deep pit, which formed the mass grave for the deceased person's retinue. The queen's body was found on a bier, a stand on which a corpse or coffin is placed. She had been buried with her fancy headdress of gold, lapis lazuli, and carnelian, an exquisite gold cup in her hand. Two female attendants were crouched against her bier, which was surrounded by burial offerings of splendid metal and stone work. Woolley surmised that during the burial ceremony, the queen and her personal servants were buried first in the lowermost tomb chamber, which then was sealed. The second phase of the funeral ceremony took place in the pit surrounding the chamber, where fires were lit, a funeral feast held, and offerings made to the gods. Then the chief domestic servants and courtiers were arrayed in the pit. Some kind of ceremony must have taken place, for musicians in the pit were buried with their fingers still resting on the instruments. The human sacrifices were probably first drugged or poisoned, as evidenced by the presence of a drinking cup near each body. Then the pit was immersed and covered with earth. In grave 789, the king's grave, the skeletons of 6 soldiers were found. They presumably were guardians of the pit who had led in oxen drawing four-wheeled carts. In each cart, the driver's body remained in the position appropriate to his task. Against the wall, there were 9 bodies of women adorned in fine jewelry. In all, there were 63 men and women buried with the king. At a later date, part of the entrance shaft, hold on, yeah. Sorry, I had to take a call, which I wasn't able to get. But anyway, you know how Satan and his crafty ways work when you get into the business. Okay, where was I? Okay. At a later date, part of the entrance shaft to this grave was refused was reused for grave 800, the Queen's grave. In this entrance, there was an ox-drawn sledge, a lyre, and other valuable domestic utensils, and the skeletons of 10 men and women. The women wore elaborate headdresses and jewelry and may have been court musicians. Another grave, named the Great Death Pit, contained the bodies of 6 men and 68 richly adorned women. Again, 6 guards were lined up at the entrance. The women consisted of 4 harpists and 64 ladies in waiting, wearing gold and silver hair ribbons. The arrangement of the graves and the decorations and accompanying objects make it clear that, in the case of the mass graves, not only were their personal servants, presumably slaves, buried with the royal dead, but most of the other victims were high ranking courtiers and persons of distinction. According to Woolley, clearly these people were not wretched slaves killed as oxen might be killed, but persons held in honor, wearing their robes of office and coming, one hopes, voluntarily to a rite which would, in their belief, be but a passing from one world to another, from the service of a god on earth to that of the same god in another sphere. The last point is crucial in interpreting the findings in the cemeteries of Ur. We know that in a later period, Sumerian kings were deified after their deaths and even in their lifetime. This evidence of human sacrifice seems to indicate that the practice originated earlier in the proto historic period. If the living king or queen had divine attributes and incorporated the divinity, then serving them in another world, the world of the gods, must have meant not supreme sacrifice, but supreme honor. These skeletons in the grave pits showed no signs of violence or struggle, so they testify mutely to a belief in the divinity of kings and queens. Another interesting implication from the findings at Ur concerns the conspicuous waste of expensive and finely crafted burial goods. Since these were present mainly in the royal graves, their burial may have served a function for the royal successor. The wasting of resources in the service of the gods is a ritual establishing the legitimacy of the successor who could assume authority by renouncing the wealth of his predecessor. This would speak to the interpretation that rituals were still needed to maintain the authority of the king during periods of succession, a fact which other historic evidence tends to support. The burial of the king's chief servants and retainers would also assure that the new king would make a fresh start with his own group of loyal followers. The royal tombs at Ur tell us that ruling queens shared in the status, power, wealth, and ascription of divinity with kings. They tell us of the wealth and high status of some women at the Sumerian courts, of their varied craft skills, their obvious economic privilege. But the overwhelming preponderance of female skeletons over male among the buried retainers also speaks to their greater vulnerability and dependency as servants. The willingness of royal servants to follow their lords into death reflected some of the basic beliefs of Sumerian religion. The world and human beings had been created for the service of the gods. People had no free will but were governed by the decision of the gods. The gods were lords, owning the cities and the temples, which they governed through their human representatives. These might be high priests or secular rulers who at first governed as representatives of a council of elders. In time of crises, such rulers might expand their personal power and come into conflict with temple authority. Secular rulers emerged in different cities under different circumstances, but they soon established their own power base. Thus, in Lagash 2350 BC, the ruler Lugalanda seized power over the most important temples, those of the gods Ningirsu and Shulshag and the goddess Ba. By placing them under the administration of an official he had appointed and who was not, as formally, a priest, and by appointing himself, his wife, Baranamtara, and other members of his family as temple administrators. He also referred to these temples as the private property of the Ensi or ruler, no longer mentioned the name of the deities in temple documents, and levied taxes on the priesthood. Lugalanda and his wife became the largest landowners. The wife, Baranamtara, shared in the Ensi's power, managing her own private estates and those of the temple Baal. She sent diplomatic missions to neighboring states and bought and sold slaves. It is fortunate that extensive economic records of the temple of the goddess Bau have been preserved, and that's Bau. These cover the years of Lugalanda and of his successor, Urukagina, a period in which tensions between king and community are visible and the authority of the king is increased. Urukagina's short reign was marked by his reforms, which he recorded as inscriptions on buildings. Urukagina seized power from Lugalanda, claiming that he acted in behalf of boatmen, shepherds, fishermen, and farmers, and implying that he was helped by the priesthood. In the second year of his reign, Urukagina proclaimed himself king, assuming the title of Lugal. The reforms Urukagina proclaimed in his edict are the earliest documented effort to establish basic legal rights for citizens. Urukagina accused his predecessor of having taken over the gods' properties in the temples and claimed he had a covenant with the city god of Lagash to protect the weak and the widowed from the powerful. He charged that under Lugalanda, the men of the Ensi had begun to assert control over the land owned by private owners, invading orchards and appropriating fruit by force. At the same time, there had been priestly abuse of power in the form of excessive fees being charged for funerals and religious rituals. Urukagina enacted tax reforms, curbed the power of corrupt officials, and ruled the temples in the names of the gods. But scholars are divided in their evaluation of the effort of his reforms. One school regards his reign as a sort of power revolution in which free men struggled against wealthier slave owners. Another sees it as indicating a transition from temple economy to secular power and kingship. In a more recent analysis, K. Maikawa views Urukagina's reforms as an expansion of royal power, in that he developed the concept of the kingship endowed with divine sanction and extended this kingship concept to the domain of his wife, namely the temple of the goddess Bau. The personnel of this temple greatly expanded in the year Urukagina made himself Lugal. The concept of divinely endowed kingship had already begun to take hold in the reign of Urukagina's predecessors, but he concretized it in establishing the temple Ba'u as the second main temple in Lagash. Although Urukagina claimed to have enacted his reforms under divine guidance to stop the abuses of power under his predecessor, they may have simply resulted in strengthening his position. There are no records of other temple cities available, which would enable one to judge how typical this development was. And Maikawa seems to think it was not typical, but the documents offer us a significant insight in the way the transition to kingship with a new level of authority may have taken place. The documents from the reign of Urukagina offer us some tantalizing glimpses of the lives of women. One of Urukagina's edicts reads, women of former times each married two men, but women of today have been made to give up this crime. The edict continues to state that women committing this crime in Urukagina's time were stoned with stones inscribed with their evil intent. Elsewhere, the edict states that if a woman speaks disrespectfully to a man, that woman's mouth is crushed with a fired brick. Recent feminist commentators have interpreted these edicts as evidence of the former practice of polyandry and of its end during Urukagina's regime. This interpretation seems This interpretation seems without substance since there is no other piece of evidence available from anywhere in Mesopotamia of the practice of polyandry in the third millennium BC. The interpretation of cuneiform text in a highly complex technical matter and usually depends on corroborating evidence from other texts or from archaeological artifacts. Assyriologists have been justifiably cautious in interpreting this edict in the absence of such evidence. There are, however, at least two possible alternate interpretations of the text. One, that it refers to a tax reform whereby a tax on divorces was eliminated, thus ending the abuse that a married woman who had not secured a divorce due to its high cost took a second husband. The other possible interpretation is that the edict refers to widows and forbids their remarriage. This seems to me the most likely interpretation, since restrictions on the remarriage of widows appear in various Mesopotamian law codes, and improvements in their situation are enacted in the Hammurabic laws considered considerably later. The second edict concerning a woman's remarks addressed to a man is even harder to interpret. If it refers to a sexual solicitation or a slanderous statement by a woman to a man, the penalty is relatively mild in terms of Mesopotamian standards of justice. The most we can say about it is that it seems an early instance of the regulation of female behavior by secular authority, although we must remember that Urukagina's edicts did not have the force of laws. The interpretation that Urukagina's edicts denote a sharp and decisive deterioration in the status of women seems unwarranted, especially in view of the additional evidence of women in positions of power, which we will discuss. In another of his reforms, Urukagina decreed that the pay and compensation in food for three male funerary officials be sharply reduced, and that a high priestess be added to the list of funeral officials receiving pay. This tells us nothing about changes in the status of women, but it does tell us about the presence of women in high cultic office, a fact for which there is much corroborating evidence. The economic records of the Temple Ba'u offer a vivid picture of the various roles and functions women performed in the early parts of the third millennium, at least in Lagash. The temple of the goddess Ba'u, while its area extended over only approximately 1 square mile, employed between 1,000 and 1,200 persons year round. The entire administration of this temple and of its personnel was in the hands of Queen Shagshad, Urukagina's wife, who also managed the temple devoted to the children of the goddess Bau, which was nominally under the administration of the children of the royal couple. As administrator of these two temples, the queen exercised legal and economic authority over her domain. She also functioned as chief priestess in the temple. In the year of Euryclena's reign, the domestic staff of the queen consisted of 150 slave women employed as spinners and wool workers, brewers, millers, and kitchen workers. The wage list also mentions one female slave singer and several musicians. Other laborers were freemen who drew weekly supplies of food and were also furnished seed corn and plow animals. 100 fishermen provided fish. The male swineherd employed 6 slave women to grind the grain for feeding the swine. In the kitchen, there were 15 cooks and 27 female slaves doing menial work. The brewery employed 40 male workers who were freemen and 6 female slaves. Approximately 90 workers took care of animals, among them 5 cowherds, the chief of whom was the brother of the queen. This latter interesting bit of information from the wage list tell us incidentally that the queen was, as her husband probably was, a commoner by birth. The record shows that under Euryclena's predecessor, each of the royal children had a complement of servants and had independently held properties. Each child had a wet nurse, a nursemaid, several maids, one cook, one smith, several slave women milling grain, a gardener, and several assistant gardeners. This lavishness was somewhat restricted under Euryclena's regime. There are no wet nurses listed, possibly because the children had outgrown the need of them, nor were there nursemaids. Each child had 1 to 2 personal servants, and a hairdresser served them all. Each child also had long land holdings of his or her own, and the slaves and artisans necessary for the maintenance of these holdings. The fact that King Euryclena consolidated his personal and family power and holdings, despite his assertions to the contrary, can be seen by comparing the personnel list of the temple Ba'u for each year of Euryclena's regime. Year 1 through 434, year 2, the year of Lugalship, 699, year 3, 678. A separately kept list of slave women and their children showed a similarly dramatic increase for year 2, year 1 through 135, year 2 through 229, year 3 through 206, year 4 through 285, year 5 through 188, and year 6 through 221. Euryclena was violently overthrown by another usurper king, Lugal Zagizi, from the city of Umma. Although the latter expanded his holdings and made himself supreme ruler of all of Sumer, he was not able to consolidate his conquests and administer them as a unified state. This feat was accomplished by the man who overthrew him and ended the independence of Lagash, King Sargon of Akkad, 2350 through 2230 BC. In the period of Euryclena, we can then observe the earliest stage of the formation of kingship and city states, which precedes the formation of nation states. We notice that militarism and the employment of slave women in the temple estates are already well established. We notice also tensions and conflicts between various groups of property holders, the king and his men, private land and slaveholders, the priestly rulers of temple estates, and free communities of small landowners. In these conflicts, usurpers of the kingship, who by definition were military men, made use of their families, especially their wives, to consolidate and secure their power. Thus, women of that class had positions of significant economic, legal, and judicial power and could quite frequently represent their husbands in every respect. At the same time, lower class women were filling a great variety of economic roles as both artisans and domestic industry workers, while foreign slave women provided a large part of the labor force of the temples. We should also notice that in the very first effort by a king to establish law and order by proclaiming an edict, one of the aspects of regulation concerns the gender role of women, that is, their right of remarriage and their speech toward men. That fact, while it is inconclusive in isolation, will assume greater significance as we later analyze the various law codes. In this respect, Eurycogene's ethic stands near the beginning of a slow and wavering process of transition in the status of women and the definition of gender, which took almost 2,500 years. It is this process this book seeks to document and interpret. King Sargon of Akkad, a Semitic ruler, founded a dynasty which extended over sections of Sumer, Ashur, Assyria, Ashur is Assyria, Elam, and the Euphrates Valley, circa 2371 through 2316 BC. To govern this vast and unruly domain, Sargon established garrison cities and made alliances. He also strengthened his rule by installing trusted persons as governors over the formerly independent city states, which had now become part of his domain. He installed his daughter, Hedwana, as his high priestess of the moon god temple in the city of Ur and of the temple of An, the supreme god of heaven, at Ur. Since Echin, what is her name? Inca Duana was also a lifelong cultic devotee of the Sumerian goddess Inanna. Her appointment symbolized the fusion of Inanna with the Akkadian goddess Ishtar. It appears that Ekaduana was highly gifted and politically astute. Sargon spoke Akkadian and elevated this language to the official administrative language, but his daughter was a distinguished poet, the first known woman poet in history, and she wrote in Sumerian. One scholar states that she used these gifts to propagandize the union of Sumerians and Akkadians into one state capable of carrying Mesopotamian rule to the farthest reaches of the Asiatic Near East. Enkiduana's poetry and hymns to the goddess Inanna long survived her. After Sargon's death, the new ruler of Ur removed her from her position as high priestess. She wrote of this injustice in a long hymn, appealing to the goddess Inanna to redress her injuries and return her to office. Uh, Enkiduana was often quoted and commented upon as a poet in later Sumerian writing. Similarly, Sargon's grandson, Naram-Shin the Great, appointed his daughter Enmanana high priestess at Ur. This practice was then followed by Sumerian and Akkadian rulers for 500 years. The written record shows that 13 princely priestesses held office for an average of 35 to 40 years, circa 2280 to 1800 BC. After the collapse of the Sargonic Empire and the long and complex struggle for dominance among the city states of Mesopotamia, various rulers developed dynastic and diplomatic marriages as a means of consolidating their military gains on preventing warfare. For example, in the period of the Ur Third Dynasty, the rulers of Ur contracted such marriages of their daughters with the sons of the rulers of Marai and other cities. Some poems and love songs written by ladies of the Ur Third Temple have been preserved. The tradition of dynastic marriages continued in the Near East and in other times and places, wherever dynastic rulers needed to legitimize or fortify their rule over conquered or neighboring territories. It is a higher and more elaborate form of the exchange of women practiced much earlier in most societies, and it marked off the daughters of upper class ruling families for a special and highly ambiguous role. In one sense, they were merely pawns of their family's diplomatic designs and imperialistic ambitions, not unlike their brothers, who were sometimes forced to enter such diplomatic marriages and had no more personal choice in the matter than the women did. Yet, as any close study of particular cases must show, these princesses were frequently influential, politically active, and powerful. Their role as future wives in diplomatic marriages demanded that they be given the best available education. Most likely, this trend of educating princesses so they might function as informants and diplomatic representatives of their family's interests once married, accounts for the occasional evidence of equal educational opportunities for women, even in the face of the general educational disadvantaging of women throughout historical time. What should be remembered is that this tiny group of ruling class daughters never was representative of all women of their time in society. From the third dynasty of several legal texts known as the Codex Urnama, and from the dynasties of Isin and Lara, the Codex Lipit Ishtar, have survived to offer us a glimpse of social and economic life. During this period, the practice of the appointment of princesses as high priestesses continued. The dignified and highly individualized portrait statue of the priestess Inanatuma of Isin, who supposedly also represents the goddess Ningal, gives testimony to the continued prestige and honor accruing to women in the priestly role. In the period 2000 through 1800 BC, continuous warfare and political fragmentation marked the shifting power struggle of various towns and city-states. In circa 1965 BC, Shin-Kashid of Isin conquered Uruk and founded a dynasty, building a temple in the city of Durham and establishing his daughter Nin Shatapad as high priestess there. When the king of Lara defeated her father and ended his reign, Nin Shatapad was forced into exile. She wrote an eloquent letter to her conqueror, appealing to his generosity to spare the city of Durham and her temple and to restore her to her priestly duties. This letter became a model of its kind and was included in the curriculum of the School of Scribes, of which she herself had been a graduate. This incident is important not only in showing us the initiative of a woman in public affairs, but because it gives evidence that women of this period were still being trained as scribes. As we trace the development of the role of the royal wife and daughter as stand in for her husband and father, we can draw on evidence from another culture and place, the city of Marai, which was located far to the north of Sumer, in which today is the Iraq Syrian border. A collection of royal documents dating from 1790 to 1745 BC describe a society which allowed elite women great scope in economic and political activities. Women, just like men, owned and managed property, could contract in their own name, could sue in court, and serve as witnesses. They took part in business and legal transactions such as adoptions, sales of property, the giving and taking of loans. A few women appear on the list of those offering gifts to the king. Such gifts were either a tax or a vassal's tribute, which indicates that such women had political standing and rights. Women were also scribes, musicians, and singers. They carried out important religious function as priestesses, diviners, and prophetesses. Such, since kings regularly consulted prophets and diviners before undertaking any important decision or before going to war, such persons were actually advisors to the king. The fact that the documents from Marai make no distinction as to the work of male or female prophets speaks for the relatively equal status of elite women in Marai society. The Assyriologist Bernard Frank Bato explains the position of women at Marai compared with other Mesopotamian cultures as a cultural remnant from an earlier stage of development. Only recently emerged from the tribal stage, these Amorite rulers retained many of the features of their tribal heritage in their nascent political economies. In contrast to the developed city states with their more clearly demarcated and institutionalized offices and chains of command, the northern Amorite kings seem to have retained a patriarchal style of rule. All authority was retained in the hands of the king, who personally oversaw all operations or at least personally delegated that authority as needed. The suggestion that the women's stand in role is an aspect of an earlier concept of kingly rule is intriguing and supports my analysis that women's status and roles became more circumscribed as the state apparatus becomes more complex. Some of the Marai documents offer a vivid picture of the lives and activities of these royal ladies in their role as their male relatives' deputies. The queen, the king's first wife, held independent power in palace, temple, and workshops and served as a stand in for the king when he was absent on warfare or diplomatic missions. In her own right, she managed her property and supervised the female palace personnel. The king's secondary wives, in ranking order, were installed in distant palaces, which the king apparently visited at regular intervals, and where these secondary wives performed similar administrative duties. One such was Kunshimadam, the secondary wife of King Yasma Adu of Marai. A letter written by her reveals the extent and the limits of her powers. She had established and managed the king's house or palace, and she regularly prayed for the king before the god Dagon. Now, for some unexplained reason, she had fallen into disfavor and had been falsely accused of mismanagement. Is the household which I have established to be given away to another? Kinshimadam appealed to the king. Why then have they so completely alienated me from your affections? What have I taken from your house? Instruct your controllers that they should inspect your house. Save my life. Do you know that these are the words which I constantly pray before Dagon for you? Let all be willed with Yasma Adu, that I, for my part, may prosper under his protection. The wife's power, like that of the male vassal, depended on the will and whim of the king. Like the feudal vassal of a later age, Kunshimadam understood that only in her lord's protection was there any safety for her. In her case, this protection availed little. Yasma Adu, himself an Assyrian usurper, was overthrown by Zimri Lim, who thereby regained the throne of his fathers. At that time, Kunshimadam, together with all the other royal ladies, would become part of the victor's spoils. As later in Israel, the victor acquired the harem of the former king as part of legitimizing his claim to the throne. Such a fate had befallen the many daughters of another Marai king who reigned before Zimri Lim. When their father was deposed by an Assyrian conqueror, these genteelly raised daughters, who had been trained in the art of singing, were given as slaves to a minor official in the new government. They were not sent to the textile factories but became domestic slaves. The correspondence of Queen Shiptu with her husband King Zimri Lim is of particular importance. B.F. Bado comments about her. Shiptu's role is exceptional both in its scope and in the sheer multiplicity of activities in which she was engaged. Her influence was felt everywhere. It is no wonder that so many curried favor with her. Queen Shiptu served as her husband's deputy during his frequent absences. She received reports from the administrators of the city Marai. The governor of Turka, a neighboring city, reported to the queen, his mistress, on business matters and executed her orders. Governors and vassal kings paid homage to her in terms usually reserved for the ruler himself. Shiptu offered sacrifices, supervised oracles and omen taking, events of great significance of which she regularly advised the king. She also carried out the king's instructions. In one case, her husband ordered her to dispose of some female captives he was sending home. In among them are some Ugbabatam priestesses. Pick out the Ugbabatam priestesses and assign them the rest to the house of the female weavers. Choose from the 30 female weavers, or however many you who are choice and attractive, who from the toenails to the hair of their heads have no blemish, and assign them to Wara Lisu. And Wara Elisu is to give them to Sabarian Vale. Also, their status document is to be changed. Give instructions about their rations so that their appearance does not worsen. And when you select the female weavers, let Rawa Ilusu guard them. Here, obviously, the king instructed his wife to select women from among the captives for his harem. His concern for their beauty and his instruction that they be given food adequate to maintain their appearance testify to that. But in a subsequent letter, the king countermanded this order. He wrote to his wife, "There will be no more booty available for my disposition. I will myself select from this booty which I will get the girls for the veil and will dispatch them to you." The wife's cooperation in the matter is taken for granted, and her husband's sexual use of the captive women, which served not only to gratify his pleasure, but to enhance his property and status, is assumed as a routine matter. Still, as we have seen from the case of Kun Shamaram, any new sexual liaison of the husband was a potential threat to the standing of the first wife, even though the latter was legally in a more secure position than secondary wives. King Zimri Lin arranged political marriages for his daughters. When he married his daughter Kiram to Kayasumu, the ruler of Ilansuru, he also appointed her mayor of Kayasumu city. Kirum, who seems to have been a quite spirited woman, exercised her authority as mayor. She also corresponded with her father concerning political matters and freely offered him advice. Her activities displeased her husband, who became more and more bitter toward her. The marital conflict was aggravated by the fact that Kayasumu had also married a sister or half sister of Kirum, a woman named Shabatam. The relationship between the two sisters and which of them is the first and which is the secondary wife is not clearly established in the documents available to us. The marriage of two sisters to one husband occurs in a number of instances in Mesopotamian society. In this particular case, it worked out badly for Kiram. The husband clearly preferred Shabbatam, and the marriage got so bad that Kiram asked her father for permission to return home, which would be tantamount to divorce. In a letter to her father, she vividly described one in a long line of domestic quarrels. Hayasumu arose and spoke thus to my face: "You exercise the mayorship here, but since I will surely kill you, let him come, your star, and take you back." Your star is her form of address to her father. The letter continues: "She arose, Shematam, before me, saying as follows: As for me, let my star do with me whatever he likes, but I will do whatever I like. If he, the king, does not bring me back, I shall die. I will not live." Despite this desperate plea by Kiram, her father apparently did nothing. In her next letter, Kiram threatened more dramatic action. "If my lord does not bring me back, I will head toward Marai and there jump fall from the roof." This had the desired effect. The father, once again absent on some business, instructed his wife to arrange to bring Kiram back to Marai. This is no formal record of a divorce, but the effect was the same. King Zimri-Lim had a score of daughters. 8 of them were given in marriage to vassals of their father in hope that this would tie the husbands closer to the king. These women often acted as intermediaries between father and husband. Thus, one of the daughters, Tispatam, appealed to her father to send 100 troops to help her husband in some local warfare. Otherwise, she stated, the enemy will seize the city. Now, precisely on my account, are people concerned about him, saying, "How can he be married to the daughter of Zimri Lin and be loyal to Zimri Lin? Let my father and Lord take note of this." Clearly, the point of such diplomatic marriages was to make secure alliances between local rulers, and they implied mutual obligation. One cannot help but be struck by the competent and assertive tone of the daughter's letter. Another of the daughters married in a diplomatic marriage did not fare so well. Her letters are long and detailed complaints of her husband's ill treatment of her. She too appealed to her father to let her return home. In her case, the king advised, "Go and manage your household, but if it is not possible, then cover your head and come away to me." This advice did not have the desired result. The daughter fled to a neighboring ruler where her husband was content to leave her a virtual prisoner. The outcome of her marital troubles is unknown. Two of the king's daughters were Natatim priestesses, one dedicated to the god Shamash and his consort Aya at Sippur. Like all such priestesses, she had brought a dowry to the temple and continued to be provisioned by her family. Some Nadatim were very active in business enterprises, buying and selling property and slaves and giving out loans at the usual usurious interest rates. Most of them kept slaves to do the menial work. In the case of Irishtiaya, she did live in a cloister and was not content with that. She performed an important service by continually praying for the king. Excuse me. She informed him of that fact to bolster her claim for adequate rations. Her letters are plaintive. Now the daughters of your house are receiving their rations of grain, clothing, and good beer. But even though I alone am the woman who prays for you, I am not provisioned. This theme recurs in several of her letters. In one of them, written to her mother, she says, I am a king's daughter. You are a king's wife, even disregarding the tablets with which your husband and you made me enter the cloister. They treat well soldiers taken as booty. You then treat me well. It is not quite clear whether her complaints are due to the fact that her parents did neglect her or whether the neglect was on the part of the temple officials. One of her statements seemed to indicate the latter. My rations of grain and clothing with which my father keeps me alive, they once gave me, so let them give me them now, lest I starve. B.F. Bato notes that similar complaints occur in the letters of several Natadim at Sippur. This may reflect, he thinks, certain stylization which detracts somewhat from our sense of immediacy. It may also reflect corruption or negligence on the part of the temple officials. Irishtiaya may have been victimized by her family or by her superiors at the temple, but her own attitude towards those who served her was less than charitable. She wrote to her father, last year you sent me 2 female slaves, and one of those slaves had to go and die. Now you have brought me 2 more female slaves, and one slave had to go and die. The princess herself, as she claimed, threatened with starvation, was moved to nothing more than annoyance and irritation by the death of 2 slaves. This is some of the information we have about the daughters of King Zimri Lim. Their letters offer us intimate glimpses of family life some 3,500 years ago and show a group of articulate and spirited women engaged in public and private affairs and asserting their rights in a self-confident manner. When were they an exceptional group of women? Okay. We know that Zimri Lim delegated more authority and power to the women in his family than was customary. For example, a woman named Aduduri, who may have been his mother or elder sister, acted as his deputy in supervising religious offerings and oracles at Marai. She purchased supplies and at other times made legal decisions. We cannot say with certainty whether other princesses were given similar authority. On the other hand, one might conclude from the violent and successful reaction of Kuram's husband that the granting of independent authority to the wife by the father was an unusual and unacceptable practice. The rich pictorial remnants of Mesopotamian civilization support the assumption that elite women were respected and accorded dignity in a culture which could see wisdom and authority in the female face and figure. Having briefly surveyed the fragments of evidence concerning Mesopotamian women in different cultures over a 1400-year span, what have we learned? We have seen ample evidence of societies in which the active participation of women in economic, religious, and political life was taken for granted. Equally taken for granted was their dependence on and obligation to male kin and or male or husbands. For the ruling elite, their self-interest as usurpers to the kingship demanded that the form in which they established power become that one observer has aptly called patrimonial bureaucracy. The security of their power depended on installing family members in important subordinate positions of power. Such family members were in this early period um, sorry, lost my place. Um, Okay, the security of their power depended on installing family members in important subordinate positions of power. Such family members were in this early period quite often women, wives, concubines, or daughters, who, so to speak, become the first liege lords of their husband, father, or king. Thus emerged the role of the wife as deputy, a role in which we will find women from that period forward. We have seen the extent and the limits of her power represented by Queen Shiptu carrying out her husband's orders in ruling the realm and in selecting women for his harem from among the captives. Her image can serve as an apt metaphor for what it means, what it meant then, and what it has meant for nearly 3,000 years for a woman to be upper class. Queen Shiptu's role of wife as deputy is the highest to which such women can aspire. Their power derives entirely from the male on whom they depend. Their influence and actual role in shaping events are real, as is their power over the men and women of lower rank whom they own or control. But in matters of sexuality, they are utterly subordinate to men. In fact, as we have seen in the cases of several royal wives, their power in economic and political life depends on the adequacy of the sexual services they perform for their men. If they no longer please, as in the case of Kiram or Kinshamadim, they are out of power at the whim of their lord. Thus, women came to perceive themselves quite realistically as dependents of men. This is beautifully expressed in the prayer of Kunshamatam. Like the feudal vassal of a later age, she understood that her only safety was in her Lord's protection. It is striking and chilling to contemplate that she prayed not for her own protection, as self-interest might dictate, but for her Lord, that I for my part may prosper under his protection. What we see here is the emergence of a set of power relationships in which some men acquired power over other men and over all women. Thus, elite men thought of themselves as those who might acquire power over others, wealth in goods and wealth in sexual services, that is, the acquisition of slaves and concubines for a harem. Women, even the most secure, highborn, and self confident, thought of themselves as persons depending on the protection of a man. This is the female world of the social contract. Women denied autonomy depend on protection and struggle to make the best deal possible for themselves and their children. If we remember that we are here describing a historical period in which even formal law codes have not yet been written, we can begin to appreciate how deeply rooted patriarchal gender definitions are in Western civilization. The matrix of patriarchal relationships between the sexes was already firmly in place before economic and political developments fully institutionalized the state and long before the ideology of patriarchy was developed. At this early stage, the transition from one class to another was still fairly fluid, and upward mobility was a distinct possibility even for the lowest classes. Gradually, membership in a particular class became inherited. The decision transition to the new social organization was the institutionalization of slavery. In order to understand more about the connection between family structure, the development of slavery as a class system, and the institutionalization of state power, we must look more closely at these aspects of historical development and attempt and reconstruct the texture of the lives of non elite women. And I'm going to cut it off right there. That's the end of chapter 3. Stay tuned for chapter 4, The Woman Slave. We will go into that tomorrow. Again, thank you for listening. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. Don't forget to donate at Cash App, Sistah for Sisters, or PayPal. If you have any questions, you can email me at the same email address for the PayPal, sistahforsisters.com. I'm sorry, sistahforsisters@gmail.com. And that's it for me, y'all. Shalom.